Let's talk about one thing that is probably contradictory in terms of empathy, and that is numbers. And the reason I bring this up is because there is this dichotomy in leadership about the concept that empathy is a female characteristic or trait. I think we've dispelled that myth. We know that actually empathy is about listening to understand. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make touchy-feely decisions. It just means that you're better at understanding than you would have been if you had dismissed those assumptions. But at the end of the day, is there a correlation between organizations that are able to develop greater empathy in terms of understanding their employees, in terms of understanding their customers, or in terms of understanding their other leadership, what I refer to as the secret army? Or is it that organizations that are listening deeper actually find ways of making better products or services that can actually serve their audience, and in so doing are able to demonstrate a connection between empathy and finance? Or is that just a nice to have and actually there's no connection between it? We just know that it's the right thing to do because it feels like the right thing to do.
There's a little bit in here that's a bit of art versus science. So as a person with a maths degree, right, I love numbers. I love being able to bring these things back and look at correlations and causation and all of those wonderful regression analysis. Love it, all about it. The only thing we need to be careful of is when we start using terms like empathy and then trying to measure or metricate them. And I think this is a really challenging point. So the first thing I'd think we should tackle is the idea that if you can't measure it, it's not important. We have to measure everything. If you can't measure it, it mustn't make sense. If I asked you, Gina, do you love your husband?
This is definitely yes, thank goodness. Hope he's not listening. It can be, because the answer is yes, so we're good.
Do you measure it?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because as a marketer who's dabbled a little bit in research, and as someone who has a master's degree that I did through qualitative and quantitative surveys, I understand that you can measure stuff that isn't necessarily quantitative, but the only way you can measure it is in comparison. So I could say, yes, I love my husband 10 out of 10 today, but tomorrow I might only love him 9.5 out of 10. And on days where I'm feeling particularly lovey-dovey, I might love him 10.5 out of 10, which I'm sure the mathematician in you goes, no, you can't have 10.5 out of 10. But I'm simply illustrating a point that it is possible to measure the unmeasurable, but it's only possible to measure it from a deeply human perspective. And perhaps that's your point about empathy being very hard to measure, to quantitate. I don't know if that's a mathematical term or if you just made that up.
It's incredibly subjective, I think, is the challenge here, because your 9.5 out of 10 and my 9.5 out of 10 almost certainly aren't the same. And even if let's say you're a 10 out of 10 today, if you told me that doesn't give me insight into what's really going on in your relationship. It hides all of that rich humanity that goes on and the abstractness of it. It's a bit like art and paintings, right? Can you write a formula for a $4 million painting? Well, no, you could probably put 8 $4 million paintings next to each other and they will look nothing alike. They'll share almost no qualities. And if you ask someone, well, why is that a good painting and that's not a good painting? We know that there's a lot of subjectivity in that. And so when we think about measuring empathy, what we're saying is, how well do we understand or seek to understand each other? How good are we at building a depth of understanding of the abstract nature of the things that we love and like and hate and fear and all of that rich tapestry that goes on? And essentially what we run into is inside the subconscious mind is a really rich tapestry of emotions that do not have to follow any logical sequence. There is nothing, and look, a good example of this is dreams, right? So there's a lot of research into part of your brain, I can't remember which part exactly, but there's a feature in your brain which basically does reality testing. It says, well, is that possible? Can that happen? And it allows you to, take in information and make good assumptions about what those that information might mean. It gets switched off at nighttime when we sleep. And so our dreams, we can have a dog can turn into an elephant, and then it can turn into our friend Bob. That can all happen, and nothing in your brain goes, whoa, hang on, that shouldn't have happened. It just rolls with it and goes on. So in this deep subconscious, there are no rules that have to be followed or that govern the behavior. So when we go to overlay a really logical, rational framework across it, we should expect it to be imperfect and to fail us sometimes. Now, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't try. You can definitely have that subjective assessment and say, okay, as a leadership team, how do we feel like we're going in terms of empathy? How do we feel like we're building understanding? Are we asking open questions? Are we really trying to get past to something? We can ask these sorts of things, and people can say, yeah, I think we're going okay or not okay. And we can use that as a way of saying, well, what effort should we put in to improve? But when we try and boil it down to say, well, our company's 83 in terms of empathy, I feel like we've spent a lot of effort to get a number that doesn't have any meaning anymore. And I have the same thoughts about employee engagement scores.
I was just going to suggest that, because you can quantify any process, and people do quantify processes. You look at the NPS score, which is NPS, technically the S stands for score, and you start looking at who are your net promoters and who aren't. Now, that is a deeply human and subjective discussion that has been quantified. If you are 1 to 6, you are meh. If you're 7 and 8, you're yeah. And if you're 9 and 10, you're yes, we're definitely a promoter. That's completely arbitrary in a way. And yet someone decided they wanted to do this and someone put that into place. So who's to say that we couldn't have an arbitrarily defined empathy score with some kind of mathematical model that determines what the likelihood of the proclivity of having empathy or not?
You absolutely can. And I don't think it's wrong to do it. I only ask, what purpose do you have for getting that score? So, for example, if an organization, almost all organizations I know, they measure their profitability, profit and loss statements. And I'll say, well, why do you do that? And if their answer is because we need to hit certain targets, we need to stay solvent, we need to return. Okay, well, that makes sense. If I was to say we measure our culture, well, why do you do that? Now, unfortunately, there's some organizations that come up with a culture score because it's in their KPIs. Their culture has to be over 75. And in setting that mark, they lose the answer to why are we doing this? Why are we doing it should be because we believe that an engaged workforce delivers better results for themselves and for us. Now, I know it seems like, well, that's obvious, that would go together, but in chasing the numbers, we sometimes forget the meaning. And this is where I talk a lot about this caution. We need to be very clear on anything that's intangible. So anything that is a bit subjective, culture, relationships, values, ethics in some cases, or morality, if you like. These types of things. Purpose is another one, which is very big at the moment. When you say your purpose, it's a bit abstract. It has sort of an abstract sense of meaning and feeling to it. If you really refine that down to a set of numbers, you'll almost certainly have a very pointed, you'll have a nice sharp pencil, but you've cut away a lot of that abstract meaning. And there's a caution that we need to do in this process. It comes down to, it's a bit like art. If you said to someone, well, no, those Picasso can't be good art because it doesn't look perfect. Well, you've actually lost the meaning and the inspiration and the emotions that those artworks generate for us as humans. So let's make sure that when we're diving into this space, we don't destroy some of that abstract beauty.